Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi to Ask Zajef Nahida Edition. So, for the past year and a half, 2 years, I don't know exactly, but for the past while, I've done Ask Zajefs by posting on YouTube community post section and gathering questions there and answering them on stream. But one thing I've noticed is that when I do that, I end up answering a lot of the questions kind of along the way, because some questions lead into one another, right? And it ends up to the videos often having parts that are relatively repetitive. And to avoid that, I've decided that instead of gathering questions in advance, I'll just have people ask questions directly live. With that said, we can get right into the questions. If I'm building crit Nahida for on-field, is 574 EM a good amount to have, or is it better to go full EM? I'm running R5 Widsith. If you're building crit Nahida for on-field, it's either you're doing on-field Nahida in a Quicken team, or you're doing a hyperbloom team. It kind of matters which one you do, but honestly not that much for the overall conclusion. As a general rule, especially when you're running Widsith, right? There's going to be the option that you get the 480 EM from Widsith, and that makes it so that you will overcap this passive, the passive that gives you damage percent and crit rate based on your EM, potentially very, very easily. And any elemental mastery past this isn't nearly as good. Yes, she does scale with EM, but she's a dual scaler with attack and EM, and without the EM double dipping, thanks to this passive, EM on her just isn't that great. On top of that, you can have the elemental mastery from your Ascension 1. The reality is that especially with Widsith, it's a bit cringe to build for her, because if you build for your damage with the EM from Widsith, you want to build less EM, but if you get any other buff, you're doing less damage. I think that somewhere around that 500-600 mark is pretty good, honestly. Personally, I just ignore the EM buff from Widsith and just be like, okay, we'll just build for if we don't get the EM buff. Maybe not strictly if we don't get the EM buff, but I wouldn't intentionally keep myself under 520 EM just for this at the very least. Because especially, right, if you're running an animal unit in your team that's going to be running full EM, then this is going to be basically 250 EM. 250 EM from this, 480 EM from this. That leaves you can only build 270 EM. And she ascends with EM, so that's 115. You get 187 from your sands, you already have more than that. To me, that's not a realistic way to really build her. And so I just, again, right, build as if you don't get this, and maybe don't necessarily try to reach that exactly 1000, and you'll be good. I think that's the best way to go about it. What main stats on Nahida if she's the driver on a Quicken team, or is it just EM always? When you're using her as a driver, you're gonna get a lot more damage from her normal attacks and charge attacks versus only from her E. And her normal and charge attacks do not deal damage based on her EM. Now, you are getting spread procs with her, but once you start getting a decently high amount of EM, because spread also procs from crit and from damage percent, then it makes it so that you don't even want to build EM for the spread over crit. Especially because your EM isn't giving you damage percent and crit rate to your normal attacks, it's only to your elemental skill. What that means is that when you're on-fielding her, it makes the optimal build lean more towards EM damage crit than triple EM. But honestly, her normal attacks damage isn't that insanely high. It's not going to be that huge of a deal if you're not on EM damage crit, and if you have a triple EM with actually significantly better stats, then you can just stick to that. But the slight increase from getting better main stats, in my opinion, isn't worth changing her build around and gearing for 5 minutes every time I want to play her. But honestly, I think that the main thing you should focus on is the substats and getting a good crit ratio, right? If you're at 15% crit rate, 170% crit damage, there's something wrong. And maybe you should run a crit circlet. How does C1 Nahida work, and is it worth it? So effectively, what C1 Nahida does is it makes it so that no matter what, your burst will always give you at least the 0.4 second trigger interval increase, the 5.35 duration extension, and the 23% damage bonus. It's a little bit more than that when you actually have it fully leveled up, but about that, right? And then if you also have Electro, Pyro, and Hydro characters, you can get an additional stacks and get 2 more easily. Practically, though, the teams where people tend to use Nahida the most are Hyperbloom and Quicken teams, which means that you're very often already getting at least 1 stack of Electro. The biggest increase from any of these, by far, is the first stack of Electro. The trigger interval decrease is very good, assuming you can actually trigger it faster if the trigger interval is decreased, but generally will be able to. What that means is that when you are playing her in those hyperbloom and quicken teams, her C1 doesn't do quite as much. Now, is it doing nothing? No, it's still doing something. In the hyperbloom teams, you're often not running 2 electro units, so you're still getting a 0.22-ish at level 10 trigger interval decrease, which is still useful. And on top of that, you're getting a little bit more damage on her E from the Pyro one. Nahida C1 isn't useless. I don't want you to take away from this that it's useless, but it isn't that insane. One thing that I've noticed personally playing a lot of Nahida is, especially in hyperbloom teams, when you're not on fielding your hyperbloom trigger, often using her burst isn't necessarily a DPS loss, but it's kind of not really a significant change to your DPS. And I personally preferred keeping my burst for iframes or for when the bosses are in phases where I can't hit them. I like when the Weenut's in the ground or the Rune Serpent. I think in like, what, 4 days of this Abyss being out, I've used Nahida's burst more than I've used it in all of the previous Abyss cycle. Yeah, that's something that can go into how much value this has. If you're not using your burst, it doesn't do anything, obviously. That being said though, the teams where you don't really care about using her burst, it's basically just like double Hydro Hyperbloom. And almost every other team, her burst is very, very relevant to use. And it's not even useless to use in double Hydro Hyperbloom, it's just that it takes a very long time to use your burst because it's a very long animation. So the damage that you get is more or less cancelled out by the damage that you lose from not attacking them for its duration. Anyways, overall, her C1 is kind of just whatever. If you care about Nahida teams, I don't think this is a particularly big deal. If you get it, you get it. That's cool. I don't think it's all that worth just going straight for it, though. Yeah, that's fair. I just saw a comment in chat. Her C1 does do a bit more for Nilou teams. That is fair, because in Nilou teams, you can't get the Electro trigger interval decrease, so it is nice for Nilou teams. And it also just does more in any team that doesn't run Electro, any of the Burgeon teams. I like playing Burgeon a lot. I know that Burgeon isn't a particularly popular archetype, but I have a lot of fun with it, and it's not bad at all. It's just more restrictive. How big of an upgrade is she for Alhaitham teams? It'll depend on which Alhaitham teams, but it boils down to the fact that she is, one, really good at generating Dendro energy. Like, Alhaitham doesn't insanely care about the energy. He has ways of getting around and doing actually outputting DPS even if his burst isn't up, but that doesn't mean you don't want his burst to be up, right? So it's a useful thing. It does a lot of damage, and this EM buff matters a lot more for Alhaitham than it does for a lot of other units. Because again, Alhaitham, just like Nahida with her A4, he scales with EM in more ways than one, right? He has a direct EM scaling on his E, and he has a passive that gives him damage percent based on his EM. And then on top of that, you also have the spread. But point being, the EM on him is nice. And because he doesn't ascend with EM, unlike Nahida, and because he doesn't have a way to increase his own EM like Nahida does if you on-field her, and finally, because his passive isn't quite as good as Nahida's passive, in a lot of situations, you end up with just not that much EM on your Alhaitham, and you end up being relatively far from actually capping this. You're not actually capping this passive just from his build alone, which means that basically every Alhaitham team, the 250 EM from Nahida will also give you basically 25% damage. So what this means is you just end up with a lot of things that help. And then on top of that, the fact that Nahida can run Deepwood and not feel bad about it, you end up with a lot of things that increase Alhaitham's effectiveness when you're playing him with Nahida. Does that mean that you can't play him without Nahida? No, it doesn't. At the end of the day, you can always just play Alhaitham in like a hyperloom team without Nahida, and he'll still be fine. But he doesn't do, when you're using him in those teams without Nahida, he's often just a downgrade to her. Because as it turns out, when you're playing hyperloom teams, your form of Dendro application is only on field. It means that whenever you're going off field, you stop applying Dendro, and you're losing all of those hyperlooms that you could get during your setup. And so generally, Nahida is a pretty nice unit to have with Alhaitham, and if you're an Alhaitham main and you like using him, Nahida will be kind of nice for you. How valuable is Nahida compared to Furina, assuming one already has Alhaitham? That's an interesting question. Again, it really boils boils down to the teams you want to play. The reality is that there's a lot of teams that are more than good enough to clear, and it kind of just reaches the point where you should pull for whichever unit helps you improve the teams that you want to play. So if what you want to play is, I don't know, a Bennett carry team, for example, Nahida's not doing shit for that. If what you want to play is, I don't know, Toma, then, well, Furina's not going to help you play him very much, right? Whereas Nahida will. I will say, like, with Alhaitham, like, Nahida isn't necessarily always in Alhaitham's best teams. You can also use Alhaitham Baiju teams if you're also running Furina. I don't like it as much, but it is something that is very playable and, like, it's good. Like, when I say that I don't like something as much, it's not always just because it's bad. If it's because it's bad, I'll say it. I don't like it as much because I feel like it's a bit more of a waste of your units, but it's not bad. Specifically for Alhaitham, I think I'd prefer going for Nahida, but honestly, you can justify either of them. But yeah, for other carries in general, it's kind of just whichever one works better for that specific carry. And if you don't have a specific carry in mind, personally, I think that Nahida is just overall a lot more versatile, enables a lot more different things than Furina does. So I would personally lean towards Nahida over Furina. But that doesn't mean that Nahida is always going to be better for your account than Furina can be. How are Furina teams with Nahida? Is Prototype Amber enough or needed if you have Kuki? Kuki is generally not really enough healing for Furina teams. Now, she is enough healing that you will still get stacks, but you won't get as many stacks, and more importantly, after a few rotations, Furina's damage will significantly decrease because the rest of your team will spend a decent portion of the time under 50% HP, or at 50% HP. What you can do to remedy that is add another source of healing, and you can do that by adding another healer, or you can use Prototype Amber. And using Prototype Amber paired with Kuki's healing and Furina's Ascension passive that heals the rest of your team when you heal your on-fielder over full HP. All of those things together will generally be enough to sustain your team and at least get good uptime. Maybe not necessarily full uptime, because like, especially if you start actually getting hit, Kuki's healing, well, isn't the best. And so it may not necessarily be enough for full uptime, but at least good uptime. And yeah, Prototype Amber does potentially help with that a lot. Does that mean that you necessarily want to run Proto Amber? Well, the reality is that Proto Amber isn't a very good weapon on Nahida outside of that. I do think that it tends to be better than the other options when that's the case, but yeah. Could you rate how much of an upgrade she generally is over other Dendro units and the common Dendro archetypes? If we're looking at the common Dendro archetypes, we have a hyperbloom, but the hyperbloom is going to be separated in a lot of different like subcategories, right? Double hydro, hyperbloom, on-field electro, hyperbloom, on-field electro, quick bloom, on-field Dendro, quick bloom, on-field Dendro, hyperbloom. Then we got some Burgeon stuff. So you have traditional Burgeon, curry, oven. I guess you also have hyper fridge by Marie. You have Nilou, yeah. The Quicken team, so you have Aggravate, you have Spread, and then you also have like Burn Melt teams. I think that's it for the teams that are actually worth mentioning in a serious meta conversation. The other ones are funny, but they're not very good. Okay, in Double Hydro Hyperbloom, I think that she is she's an alright increase. I don't think she's that insanely significant. I think specifically Double Hydro Hyperbloom, due to its ability to on-field Yelan and to effectively significantly reduce your ER requirements on her by just spending more time on field with her, you don't actually lose that much from running Dendro MC instead of Nahida. That being said, you do become more circle impacted, which can be a huge pain in the ass, and which is one of the biggest strengths of Double Hydro Hyperbloom, is that you, like, when you're using it with Nahida, you're not restricted to rotations, you're not restricted to any, you can just mash your keyboard. She's a lot easier to play. In terms of how fast it will clear, I don't think it's actually that big of an increase, but in terms of how chill it is to play, it is a pretty nice increase. On-field Electro Hyperbloom. So this is when you're running something like Sino with Double Hydro, or I mean any of those characters with Double Hydro in general. I think that it can be good, but I think that the main like potential downside slash issue is that it can be hard to just fit a healer, which is part of why the on-field Electro Hyperbloom teams tend to be a bit worse, right? You can do it with Dory, something like C6 Dory, Nahida, Furina, Xingqiu, and that is actually pretty good. Outside of Dory, it's really hard to fit a healer, so the teams just don't tend to be all that great in my opinion. And yeah, I did just say that Dory is the best character for this team. I'm not taking that. I stand by that. C6 Dory is actually a good unit. See anything else Dory is complete dog. But C6 Dory's ability to consolidate healer role and carry role with Furina is now actually pretty good. Another part of the upsides of Dory is that you get to run Nahida because you don't need to run a healer. So obviously if you're playing Dory, Nahida will be a pretty big deal. On-field Electro Quick Bloom, I mean, especially the Furina teams. I think that just on-field Electro in general pre-Furina wasn't that great and is a lot better now because you get to run an Electro unit and then Baizhu or Yao Yao and then Nahida and then Furina, right? But I think that it's relatively reliant on having Furina. I think if you don't have Furina, those teams just don't tend to be all that great in general. But if you do have Furina, having Nahida instead of something like Dendro MC or another Electro unit will generally be pretty good. Although there are some Electro units that situationally can be good, I do think that in these teams, she's a relatively nice increase. On-field Dendro Quick Bloom. So this is when you're playing something like Alhaitham or Tichnari with one Hydro unit. And yeah, in those teams, you use Cookie as your healer with Alhaitham. You don't generally actually do that with Tichnari because you don't really want to have to stay melee range. I've found that with Tichnari, I prefer having the second Dendro unit be the healer. And so for Tichnari, I actually don't like her too much. Whereas for Alhaitham, I think she's quite good. On-field Dendro Hyperbloom, it's kind of just the same thing, but you're running Xingqiu. Honestly, these two, is basically just which Hydro unit you're running the difference. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but I think she's also pretty good for this. But you very, very well could just group these two as one thing. Hyper Fridge, I think that in Hyper Fridge, she's a bit less useful than in other teams because it's not the biggest upside of it, but one of the upsides of Hyper Fridge is that you can use the fridge mechanic, which effectively when the enemy has a cryo aura and you apply a cryo and a Dendro aura and you apply Hydro to them, it will consume less of the Dendro aura to create your bloom. In other words, you can use the cryo to preserve your Dendro aura for longer, like you use fridges to preserve lettuce for longer. That mechanic doesn't do shit for Nahida because you have too much Dendro to actually use all of it anyway. Because of that, it means that other units that can make use of this mechanic gain from the mechanic, and it closes the gap between them and Nahida. Which means that overall, you just gain a little bit less from Nahida in these teams. She's still good in these teams, she's still the best Dendro option in these teams, but I'd say that it's by a little bit smaller of a margin. Traditional version, this is just a double Hydro version, generally with either Toma or Bennett as the trigger. I think in these teams, she's pretty good. You can also use Baizhu as the Dendro unit, lets you get away with Toma without having to worry about healing because Baizhu is going to give you that. So I do think that there is the option for that, and if that's what you're doing, then obviously she's not going to do much. But if you're not using Baizhu, then she can be pretty nice. Curry Electro Burgeon. So this is making use of the aura mechanics of Electro Charge to effectively, it's making use of both the aura mechanics of Electro Charge and burning to cheat out more bloom seeds and to reduce burning uptime in your Burgeon team, on top of letting your pyro unit trigger overloads. In those teams, at the end of the day, you are just getting a lot more Dendro up with her, and it matters a lot more in the Burgeon teams in general because you need to apply more Dendro because burning is going to try to remove the Dendro, right? That's what burning does. You burn the wood. When you start a fire, there's wood, and when you finish the fire, there's no wood. No more Dendro. That's what burning does. It grinds away at the Dendro aura, and so having more Dendro can be very useful for it. That being said, Curry can struggle to fit in a healer, and because of that, you can also just use on-field Baizhu or use Yao Yao as your healer for the team. And if that's what you're doing, then Nahida wouldn't help you. Oven, Cryo Burgeon. Honestly, I don't even know if this should be included. Probably. Similar to Curry, it's pretty useful. Bain Marie, which is for Risley, basically only for Risley. And she's not actually good in this team because you need a healer and the only slot where you can use a healer if you're using Furina and and a Burgeon trigger like Toma is a Dendro slot, so you can't get away with her, and Proto Ember just doesn't do enough. Unless you're also running Proto Ember on your Risley, but at that point, what are you doing with your life? And Nilou teams, this is probably the team where she's the biggest increase. Nilou teams without her just tend to feel terrible, unless the enemies spawn very close together and there's a lot of them. And even then, it'll still feel better with her. Overall, I think that Nilou teams are the ones that rely the most on Nahida out of these teams, but they are very good with her. Aggravate is very interesting. As a general rule, Aggravate likes running Nahida, but like many of the other archetypes, Aggravate can struggle to fit in a healer. When I'm saying Aggravate, I'm talking about Quicken teams that focus mostly on the Electro. So that's generally double Electro. You're gonna want an Electro carry, you're gonna want Fischl, you're gonna want a Dendro unit, you're gonna want an Animo unit, and you're gonna want a healer. So that's 5, so you need to consolidate some of those roles. You cannot consolidate healer and Fischl. That's not happening. Fischl's not a healer, unfortunately. So if Fischl's slot is the one you're replacing for a healer, you are going to lose damage. Can you replace the carry slot for a healer? Technically you can. You can do either Dory or honestly just Kuki in that slot, and it works. You can replace the Animo slot, but you will lose grouping and damage, and that's generally not worth it in my opinion. And then finally, you can replace the Dendro slot. I think that the most viable ways of going about it are generally either replacing the carry for a healer or replacing the Dendro for a healer. And because of that, because one of those options is to replace your Dendro unit for a healer, well, if you want to run a healer and Aggravate, Nahida won't be that big of an increase for you. There's also the issue where you have to do more, you have to do specific setups if you want to swirl your Electro with Nahida, and if you're not doing them, you're gonna swirl Dendro, which isn't real. It doesn't, yeah. So that's not gonna feel great, but yeah. Next up, spread. Now, when you're looking at Quicken teams that focus around the Dendro, your team slots aren't as competitive because you don't need to run an Animo unit. Animo gives you grouping in those spread teams, but it doesn't increase your Dendro damage. And so you can get away with not running an Animo unit a lot more easily. It doesn't feel as bad. So generally, if you're playing a spread carry team, you're gonna have your Dendro carry, you're gonna have any Electro unit that can actually proc the Quicken, and then the rest is kind of just up to you. You generally want to have a defensive unit, either healer or shielder, but that can be the Electro unit because of Kuki, which means that the other two slots are very, like, you can kind of just decide whichever slots or whichever units go in there, which means that you will generally just want the units that do the most for the team. And as it turns out, that is Nahida basically always. And so in spread teams, I'd say that she is a pretty big upgrade over other alternatives. And then finally, Burn Melt doesn't exist without Nahida. It's just a joke. So technically, yeah, Burn Melt cares about having Nahida a lot as well. Is it better to run Nahida on Golden Troop / Gilded Dreams over Deepwood if there's someone who could hold Deepwood, or is it somewhat similar enough that the change is not necessary? Okay, assuming that you're playing her in a team where you're not playing Hyperbloom or Burgeon, so you don't need Deepwood, and she's the only Dendro unit. So she's the only form of Dendro damage. She does similar damage with Deepwood as she does with Gilded Dreams, because you get the res shred with Deepwood, but you get significantly more stats with Gilded Dreams or Golden Troop, right? They're relatively similar. If you have a unit that can hold the Deepwood, it can be nice for them to hold the Deepwood if they don't have another set they need to be holding. You definitely can get away with, like, for example, you can use Deepwood Kuki. That's something you can do, yeah. Although generally, you don't really want to use Deepwood Kuki if you're playing Hyperbloom, because you'd rather have her on Gilded and Nahida on Deepwood. And you don't really want to use Deepwood Kuki in, like, Quicken teams either, because you're either playing an Aggravate team where you're, like, swirling Electro and you'd rather build her for damage, or you can use Instructor on her when you're playing a spread team. So theoretically, yes, you can just put Deepwood on someone else, but very often there's no one else that can hold the Deepwood where it's actually an increase to the team DPS. And then there's also the fact that other units generally don't have uptime that's as good as Nahida, so you might lose some uptime on your Deepwood. If you're running Nahida off field on Deepwood, is it better to prioritize reaching 900 to 1000 EM over having a Dendro damage bonus goblet? Honestly, it kind of doesn't matter. Her output is very similar on triple EM to EM Dendro crit. I just focus on get the right set and get as good substats as you can. Obviously, don't use a Pyro Goblet, but like between a crit and EM Circlet or between a Dendro and EM Goblet, whichever one has the better substats will generally just be the better one. And if you want a more precise answer, you'll have to use the optimizer. Is it worth going for more than 800 EM for on-field Nahida? More stats is always more good. So if you can get more EM for free, is it good? Yeah, it's always good. More stats is more good. But is it something that you should prioritize over other stats? Not really, no. Also, when you're playing on-field Nahida, that's very, very often because you're playing hyperbloom, and your hyperbloom unit wants to build full EM, and often they're going to be over 1,000, so that it wouldn't actually be 800, it would be 750. Can Instructor on another different Dendro character be competitive with Nahida's EM buffs? I'm not sure I understand the question. Instructor gives you 120 EM, which is half of what Nahida gives, and then on top of that, forces you to use a 4-star set instead of a 5-star set, which will make your Dendro unit do a lot less. So no, it isn't. And then Nahida actually does damage, and the other Dendro units kind of don't when you're playing them like as supports, like as all fielders. Like yeah, Alhaitham does damage, but you know that's not what I mean. Anyways, in Nahida, Nilou Xingqiu, Yao Yao, who's triggering the blooms? Generally, it's going to be Xingqiu. But Xingqiu's app is like weird. Xingqiu's app is consistently inconsistent in the sense that you will always be applying Hydro, but it can be 1 instance of Hydro or 3 instances of Hydro, depending on where it lines up in your rotation. Which means that there are times where Nahida will be triggering some of the blooms, unless you're like on-fielding her and like making sure that you just always keep that aura. Nahida can have some bloom ownership, but generally it will be Nilou and Xingqiu. Is Sacrificial Jade good on her, or is it cope? If it's good, is it worth upgrading it to R5? So the main thing about Sacrificial Jade is that she doesn't care about the HP, right? So effectively, it's a crit stat stick that gives you 40 EM. 40 is not a lot. It's a fine option. It's better than Solar Pearl. It's not worth buying the Battle Pass for. But it is definitely one of her viable 4-star weapons, yeah. Do you think full EM for the benefits of Nahida's burst is better in Aggravate teams compared to Tri-Purification Spread? In Aggravate teams, like actual Electro-focused Aggravate teams, you're running an Animo unit that's built full EM, so you don't need to build 80 more billion EM on Nahida specifically for this, right? You still just want to focus on her damage. Nahida should not be the unit with the most EM on your Aggravate team. Your Animo unit should be. What if Spread? In Spread teams, then yeah, you do tend to want to care a little bit more about the EM on her. Does her weapon change how you build her? I'm not giving her Fav because I think she never needs the extra ER with my current build. I mean, yes and no. The reason why she's on Fav isn't because she needs the ER. Like I've said this before, I very rarely actually use her burst. She's generally on Fav because she needs to be on Fav in some teams, and I hate having to change my builds when I play different teams. And if I play her in the teams where she doesn't need Fav, I just, oh no, generates too much energy. Whatever shall I do? If I want a build that works in every team, I have to use Fav. That's the main reason why my Nahida is always on Fav. She doesn't always need Fav. Fav is always useful in the sense that these energy particles help the rest of your team's ER, and her portion of the damage in the team is never that insanely high, so sacrificing personal damage isn't that huge of a deal, even in the cases where it is a relatively big deal. It's not like, oh no, game changing. That's why I'm very okay with having Fav basically all the time. But yeah, like it matters, especially in teams where you use a different on-fielder that cares about energy. Or, I mean, in the double Hydro Hyperbloom team, when you're actually on-fielding her, you can get multiple Fav procs, and it helps so much with your ER requirements. And I don't actually on-field her, like you know when you have a light switch and you like put it in the middle, and it's like just at the moment where like it switches on versus off, and like the light goes on and off, and then it just starts like flickering. That is the state of on or off field that my Nahida is. She's like kind of on field, but I spend a decent amount of time on Yelan because she has longer range to hit enemies, and because I can use her E to catch up to the Weena when it decides to do cringe shit. I want to make sure I use Yelan's E every 10 seconds, and because of that, right, I end up going on field on her every 6 seconds, so I can get 3 Fav procs per rotation, but I don't actually focus on her damage as much because I am swapping a decent amount, and therefore I wouldn't get that much value out of the weapons that increase her damage. So I really like Fav Codex in that specific team. There's also just the fact that it's something I've mentioned a lot, but running more ER than you need is always nice for either when the enemies decide to stall and you can't generate particles because they're stalling, or if you kill enemies in the middle of a rotation, you can get your energy for your next rotation on the next chambers a lot more easily. Actually going overboard on ER is something that makes high investment accounts feel better to play. And so that's part of the reason why my Nahida is basically always on Fav. Is it possible to build Nahida Raiden Quicken? Oh, very much so, yes. Raiden can be used in Quicken teams just like any other electro carry. If anything, I like Raiden better in Quicken teams than a unit like Sino. Is the 4 Archon hyperbloom team a good team with Nahida as on fielder, or is it cope funny stuff? It's cope funny stuff, but it's also good enough to clear. What about Nahida Plunge? No, it's not very good. I would not recommend it. I mean, fuck, it'll work, because any character works with plunges now, but it's not gonna be good. Be ready for that. Alright, I believe that's it. I don't think there's any, like, actual significantly different questions anymore. So, as, like, an ending conclusion, I can talk a little bit about the questions that were the ones at the beginning of every Ask Zajef when we just took questions. Overall, what is her place in the meta? Nahida's a good unit. She's one of the better 5 stars. You definitely don't need her, because there's no unit in particular that you need. You can clear with 4 stars only, and then on top of that, if you are actually a free-to-play player, you're not going to be 4 stars only, you're going to have a few 5 stars, and as long as you're not going for the ones that are just straight up horrendous, you can get away with basically any of them. So you don't need to go for the best 5 stars, but if that's something you care about, she is definitely one of the better ones. She's pretty versatile, she enables a lot of Dendro teams, which is nice, and I don't think that she's going away anytime soon. I mean, it's something I've mentioned a few times. I think that her design is kind of bad in the sense that I feel like they gave her too much, because she has both really good application in a large AoE and good damage, and I feel like it restricts designs for future Dendro units, because you kind of can't make an off-field Dendro anymore without them just being Nahida but bad, because they either have a worse Dendro app and they're Nahida but bad, or they have worse damage and they're Nahida but bad, or they have better of those things and like what the f are they doing? But yeah, because of that, I really don't expect them to make a unit that's just all that similar to Nahida anytime soon. I think they're gonna stick to making Dendro carries and Dendro like defensive options. And maybe I'll be proven wrong. To some extent, I kind of hope so, because I really want to see some more interesting kits for off-field Dendro. I think it's often very fun. Dendro has a lot of nutritional value. You know, you can cook a lot of stuff with it. But overall, her place in the meta is very similar to what it was when she was released, and I don't think it's changing anytime soon. But yeah, so that's gonna be that. I hope you guys enjoyed this slightly different format. Let me know what you think of the different format, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.